Hey everybody, Yankee here. You know, people are always talking about what Glock needs to do different. They're always talking about how the market has kind of gone beyond them and they need to catch up or they're going to become irrelevant. They're always saying they need to do this, they need to do that, they need to make this change, they need to stop doing this, whatever. They need to modernize. Well, I'm someone that always says, no, they don't need to do that because they just need to keep being Glocks. Glock needs to be an option. If you want those other things, now there's so many polymer guns on the market and every manufacturer makes them that if you want something different than a Glock, it exists. Go get that gun instead of asking Glock to become that. Instead of saying, well, Glock needs to be more like Smith & Wesson or Glock needs to be more like Sig Sauer, it just needs to be an alternative to Smith & Wesson or Sig Sauer. I actually prefer the Glocks to either of those guns. So I always say they don't need to change. They need to stay Glocks so that Glock is still an option on the market. I don't want a Glock that's just like a Sig Sauer because then why wouldn't I just get the Sig Sauer? But when I was talking to someone the other day, one of my viewers, I did have to admit that there is one change Glock should make. And surprisingly, it's something that Ruger's doing, and I think Glock should start doing what they're doing. It's usually the other way around. I always usually see a gun like, Kel-Tec will make something cool, but crappily made, and I'll be like, oh, I hope Ruger starts making that. Well, in this case, Ruger's doing Glock, I think, better than Glock. And I hope Glock copies Ruger, or other manufacturers have done it first. I'm not saying Ruger did this first, because they definitely didn't. But they have the gun that's very similar to a Glock that they just did with Magpul. I think it's the RXM or RMX. It's one of those, BMX something. I forget what the little letters are. But they do a Glock basically, but it's got a firing control unit that's removable, meaning that the frame is not the serialized part. And that's the one thing that I think Glock should do. And they're already mostly there. If you've ever taken a Glock apart, that whole system comes out very easily. You just unpin it from the frame and boom, it pops right out as pretty much, a connected piece. So all they'd have to do is build a little chassis around that and it would just pop right out. And then they put the serial number on the chassis, like most of these other guns that have these removable firing control units do. With Glock, it wouldn't even require much of a redesign because, like I said, it's already basically set up like that. And the reason they need to do that is because it would just give more options. Because when you have the firing control unit, the frames are very cheap because they're just a piece of polymer. They're not the serialized part. Like with the Sig Sauers, etc., you can buy frames very cheap. If you want to say, I want to change the color of my frame, buy a new frame. You don't have to buy the firing control unit. It's cheap. You can usually do it for like $40, $50. If you say, well, I want one with a rail, but mine's got a rail, well, then you buy one without a rail because it's easy to manufacture them. The makers can make them. Aftermarket people can make them. You can change the features pretty easily. It gives the buyer options. Now, I know this might cut into a little bit of people buying a different model, which I think Glock won't do. And this is the reason I think Glock won't do what I think they need to do is because Glock makes a lot of their sales based on, well, you got to buy this Glock. It's slightly different than the other Glock. Because that's all it is. It's always just slightly different than the other Glock, the next generation. If when the grip changed a little bit or had a different texture on it or had a different rail, if you just had to buy the grip frame, well, then you probably wouldn't buy the new Glock. So they'll never do this. But I think if they did, it would be so much better. I think it would be so much nicer that if you could damage your frame, or if you did damage your frame, you could replace it very cheaply. Like if it got gouged or even cracked under some circumstances, you'd replace it easily. Wouldn't cost the bank. The firing control unit is the serialized part. That's the one thing that I will concede that Glock should do, because guns like Ruger, etc. do it, so Glock could. But like I said, I think that might be something that would hurt their business model because they want you to have to buy the new Glock because the grip texture is a little different. If they were worried more about just keeping market and allowing people to have options, I think they'd probably start doing something like a firing control unit. And I hope they do, because I think Glock can still become relevant, and there's going to be people who want Glocks every day. There's going to be new buyers on the market every day. And if they're looking around and all these other guns have far more options to what you can do with the gun you buy, well, maybe as many people wouldn't move to those other makers if Glock could do that. So I think in the long run, it would probably help Glock to do it. So it is the one thing that I think Glock should change about how they manufacture their guns, and that's just make that firing control unit removable, make it the serialized part. That way people can have more options with their frames and with whatever they want to do to them, and fix damage. If they damage a frame, they can do it much more easily, much more cheaply. That, I think, would be a good thing for Glock. Like I said, don't think they'll do it, but that's one thing I think they should do to be more modern and give the buyers more options.